The Winnipeg Jets welcomed Jonathan Toews formally to Winnipeg and gave a few tidbits about this upcoming season.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, the Jets held their press conference after the first week of free agency and formally welcomed Jonathan Toews in the flesh. He gave a press conference, and the Jets kind of answered some questions about maybe what this season might look like, not only from Toews' perspective, but also from Winnipeg as a team and organization. So we'll dive into a little bit of that, and some of that actually will feed into what we talk about with how many roster spots there might be for the youth. This is a team that, quite frankly, has a real need for some internal competition, and especially with the likelihood that the foot speed of the veterans does take a little bit of a hit, this could be a great opportunity for guys like Triberkov and Lambert to really take hold of an NHL role. But will they? That is a big question. Finally, we also want to close out and talk a little bit about the whole 2C situation, because Toews is likely to be your 2C for the time being, but that's probably not going to be true the whole way through the season. So lots to get through, but before we dive in, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Firstly, though, let's start with Toews, right? So his press conference today with Chevy and company was pretty standard. I'd say that, you got him talking about where he feels he is right now. He was talking a little bit about the fact that, a lot of things have improved since obviously he dealt with a really bad bout of long COVID, went to India to get some treatment, and now he's back. He feels like he can contribute, and, he relies on the role models of guys like Marchand and Landeskog and some of these other players who are either coming back from injuries themselves, in Landeskog's case in particular, or Marchand, who continues to be an elite NHLer, even, close to 40 years old. I think with, Toews, he also was quite honest and said, look, my legs aren't quite there yet, and I think it's going to take him some real time in training this offseason to get back into game shape. And I would honestly expect him coming into the season to be, a little bit rough for the first couple months. Coming back from like a 2-year absence, especially when you had a medical condition, I don't think is ordinary. In fact, it's just very out of the ordinary. I think Landeskog maybe had a slight advantage in some ways. Obviously he had a really serious lower body injury. With Toews, it's really conditioning and respiratory based, which, is a lot about endurance, stamina, all that stuff. So hopefully it won't take him too long this summer to start feeling some of that strength coming back, but I would expect it to take a while, right? This is not an easy process to go through for anyone, let alone a guy who's now 37 and has almost been off the ice for nearly 3 years. So very big comeback for him. But the conference wasn't just about Toews, right? He talked a little bit about his role. He talked about some of his teammates, talked about sharing numbers with David Gustafsson. Gus obviously let him have that number back, and Toews said he was very appreciative. But the Jets were also sort of asked a little bit about, some of the challenges this offseason, how free agency went, what the plans are. Do the Jets feel like they're in a really good spot? Different things like that. And I think one of the most interesting questions that came up was how the team is going to deal with the foot speed. This is kind of like one of the rare moments where I think the media actually asked a pretty serious and pointed question about this team's roster composition, because the foot speed thing is a very glaring issue. You look at the roster as constructed, and based on predicted NHL lines from Daily Faceoff, here's what we might have starting next season, assuming, again, no real changes. You've got Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, and Velarde, Perfetti, Toews, and Nyquist, Nino, Nemesnikov, and Iafallo, Pearson, Kupari, and Kepka. Now, of course, Kupari is overseas, so don't worry about him. I think they forgot to pull him off. My feeling is it'd probably be either Gus or Barron, but with Barron, it is a little bit interesting, right? We haven't really heard that the Jets have open conversations with Barron's camp, which I found, at this time of year, on the one hand, you wouldn't really think too much about it because he is the fourth liner. But on the other hand, it is interesting that we've heard Velarde and Connor rumors, but we really haven't heard anything about Kupari. So keep an eye out on that one. Obviously, the Sandberg thing, they've already been in contact with Dylan's camp, so that's very much underway. But not hearing anything about Barron, I think, is super interesting. So keep an eye on that situation. But in terms of, the foot speed thing, Chevy kind of responded and said, this could be a chance for Lambert to really seize a spot. And from my perspective, on the one hand, that's exciting, right? We are all kind of hoping that Brad Lambert can really take the next step and do well at the NHL level. But I also feel like we've heard a lot about the Jets supposedly offering roster spots in competition to their prospects, and we really haven't seen it. I do feel like going forward, that's going to change. The Jets are going to be forced to do some things differently than a lot of other teams. The revenue going up for the league for the next several years, we heard that, the expansion slots for teams like Atlanta and Houston, the buy-in price is $2 billion. So the cap is only going to keep shooting up, which for the Jets is actually not great news. Winnipeg operates with an internal cap and has to do so. And, it's going to be a league of haves and have-nots for a while. So that means that your youth that you really need to not only draft, but also develop and graduate, most importantly, that suddenly becomes a critical and core foundation of your team. And so if you can kind of start that process right now and get back into it and get back to what really made Winnipeg successful, even with a lower cap ceiling, I think that would make the Jets a much more dangerous team going forward. It does seem like, though, that Winnipeg is at least cognizant of the foot speed thing, and the fact that Chevy kind of answered it already with a mention of Lambert is interesting. To me, it also kind of talks or maybe hints a little bit at some of the thinking behind this year's free agency period. I definitely feel like, so many players extending early kind of shifted focus. Winnipeg went from a team looking to make a big acquisition to kind of backpedaling a little bit and trying to find a reasonable replacement that can do the job and fill in a roster spot without committing long term. All these deals being 1 year and very low in salary is fascinating to me. And also, if you look at who they brought in, a lot of these guys are always the people that get traded at the deadline, or at least are usually involved in rumors. Guys like Nyquist and Pearson are often very popular trade guys when it comes to the TDL. So that, I think, is worth keeping an eye out in and of itself, let alone from the context of this team maybe anticipating a tougher season ahead and maybe preparing themselves for maybe needing to even do a mini sell-off, just from some of the guys that they've brought in. You bring in a couple of TDL sort of bait players, you get some draft assets, you'll still have a pretty decent foundation, you'll open some spots for the kids. It could be a win-win situation regardless. Either you're good enough to add at the trade deadline, or if things maybe take a little bit of a surprising turn, you have to sell some contracts. Not a big deal. You open up spots to bring some more youth in for experience. So I think either way, the Jets are well situated to do anything that they want this year. Not committing a lot of money to big deals for now is worth it, and I think very intelligent. I guess we'll see if they make a big trade. If that happens, obviously the complexion of the season very much changes. But so far, I think Winnipeg is kind of looking at more of a, not necessarily a bad finish, but probably more middle of the pack when it comes to what's going to be a very, very competitive West. The wild cards in the Western Conference are better than some top three divisional finishers in the East. So, finishing in that space is absolutely not insulting or not a knock against the Jets. It is going to be a very tough field this year. I also just talked a little bit about the youth, and I want to talk about this year starting off. What roster spots might actually be open for the kids? Will we see more than one prospect graduate to the Jets? We'll chat about that coming right up. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Gametime comes in. Gametime makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. I've used Gametime when I was going for Ravens versus Chiefs tickets a few years ago. It was super convenient, very easy. I even got in-arena seat views, so I knew what I was getting into when I was walking into the stadium and finding my seat in the stands. It's a panoramic view, and of course, with Gametime, the price you see is the price you pay. There are no hidden fees. And if your plans change, Gametime guarantee has your back with cancellation protection and more. Take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting a little bit about, the youth and sort of this upcoming season, which I think the Jets are quite frankly positioned very nicely to do a lot of different things. They can add if they need to, if they're in a good playoff spot. They can sell off some of these trade deadline bait players that they've picked up for, a mil or so, and maybe even get a couple of decent little picks. And if they have a perhaps not great enough finish in the season, assuming a lot of things would have to really go wrong, you could be looking at a really, really good 2026 draft pick, and one where maybe you even consider trading up if you think that you can get your hands on one of their best prospects available. So I think the Jets are comfortably in a spot to where they can go any direction they want. What I do wonder, though, is how many roster spots are going to be available for the youth. You heard me talk about the lineup earlier, and obviously, so far, I think we're looking at a lot of the free agents that have come in, likely occupying a lot of the wing spaces. But I would imagine that at least one spot is going to be available for a guy like Nikita Chibrikov. For one thing, Iafallo has traditionally been not a third liner on this team. We see him, playing all over, but oftentimes he's used on the fourth line. And so with that in mind, I kind of feel like the Jets want Chibrikov to make this team out of camp. And I'd have to imagine that he would probably take the third line spot. Eventually Lowry will come back and replace Nemesnikov. So assuming that that is the right 3C call, I think Chibri with Nino and Vlad should do decently. Nikita is a very creative player. He's got a relentless motor and a great shot. I don't know if his game is going to be super well-rounded necessarily, but I do think in a middle six role, he brings a lethal release. And he's one of those guys where I kind of wonder if he has some real untapped upside. He hit the ground running with Manitoba the past season, and I feel like there's just more to his game that we're going to see. His Russian play overseas was really good. And so he very quickly shot up Winnipeg's prospect pool standings. Kind of feels like one of those guys where you talk about, we've referred to some of the other maybe growers, not showers in some of these draft picks where Winnipeg found a couple of really good tool sets and sort of banked on that being your projection into something more impressive. And I think Chibrikov very much follows a similar pathway. Relentless motor, maybe didn't have the craziest, goal scoring numbers initially. He has really turned it on the past couple of seasons at the pro level and looks likely to be a really impact NHLer. I think my biggest question is still, is he good enough to eventually be a second liner? Because that could be a very intriguing thing if he reaches that goal. It also makes for some very interesting competition because, listen, Koepka, Pearson, Nyquist, none of these guys are likely to be really high-end impact players at this stage of their career. Koepka's, on the younger side compared to a lot of these other dudes. But, he's a really competent fourth liner. He offers some real strong defensive value, and he throws the body. He's not a guy that you're asking to score a lot of goals. Chibrikov might be one of those more prolific finishers on this team. And so for him, I think that he really has a chance to stamp his authority in camp and earn a spot. Quite frankly, had he not broken his ankle this year, I do think he would have been an NHLer and helped the Jets during the postseason run. He would have honestly been more impactful than the guys that they did trade for in Tanev and Shen. I really do believe that. And it's a shame that we didn't get to see him because Winnipeg opted to send him back to the Moose and not let him play out the full season. There's no guarantee that that decision kept him from getting injured, but we'll never really know. And I feel like that part was a little disappointing. Obviously, the team did super well and won a President's Trophy, so that you really can't complain about. But when it comes to the youth, I feel like Cherbakov might have been a guy you would have wanted to be able to recall during those moments when you really needed that extra goal scoring opportunity, that extra little finishing skill that maybe some of the other grindy types didn't have as much of. So hopefully this season he comes out and wins a spot in camp. The other player that I think people will be looking out for is Brad Lambert. Lambert, I don't envision him starting the season off with the Jets. I just feel like they're going to look at his Moose performance last year and feel like he didn't do enough to get a spot out of camp. He's one of those guys where I do think that this is sort of his make or break season. I've talked about it before. I said this probably had to be the year that he really breaks into the Jets lineup, and I still stand by that. I do think that there is a chance he potentially comes up in an injury stint and really wins a spot there. Unless he really lights it up during preseason and camp, I would expect him to start off with the Moose. But I don't think that that's the worst thing. If he starts down there, Manitoba is likely to be a lot better this year, and Lambert's a player who has always thrived off of confidence. If you give him, the right skill around him and really put him with a squad that's supportive and a successful environment, I think he could potentially really take off and become the player that I think the Jets are sort of banking on with him. So I think with Lambert, even if he doesn't win a spot, it's not the end of the world. Where I do wonder, though, is, we've talked about in the past, maybe some duos and combos of players that you put together to try and make, this top nine really shine. And, Lambert and Perfetti could actually do some really good work in my mind. Lambert will bring the transition skating and skill. Perfetti will bring the defensive awareness. I think it could kind of be a similar situation to what we saw when Perfetti played with Connor. They had some very good chemistry, and I think Perfetti and Connor both balanced each other's weaknesses out very nicely. So there are a lot of options here. I could certainly see these guys doing it. The last player that I think has a very outside shot, but that I will be watching closely in preseason and camp, is Brayden Yager. Yager, I think, is probably closer than Lambert in some ways, but given the Jets' depth chart, I don't think he has a clear opening. Brayden, obviously would make a lot of sense as your middle six center, but again, the Jets haven't really seen him at the pro level yet. It would be projecting a lot and expecting a lot for him to come out and immediately make the jump from juniors to the NHL. But I have a lot of confidence in him. I think Yager is more primed for competition for a roster spot this coming season than people think. I think he'll make a real push. He'll probably be a really late camp cut. And so look out for him. If he does do enough to really prove that he gets an NHL audition, that could be very intriguing. Again, a lot would have to happen, and looking at this roster, I don't see in an immediate way that he slides in. I think the Jets will probably lean on their vets for the most part. It's their usual pattern. We know that. But at least one young player will go in, and it's probably on the wings. I don't expect it to be a center. It just doesn't feel like that's Winnipeg's plan. But later in the season, should Yager really do well with the Moose this year, I don't know. Maybe there's a real chance for him to actually make the jump sooner than we think. Winnipeg has been looking for a 2C for a while. I don't think Toews was necessarily signed with the expectation that he would be the 2C the whole year. I think that they're certainly planning on him doing it for the time being, but I can imagine that there's a scenario where they're looking to trade him to a different part of the lineup and not ask him to be the 2C the whole year. That's a lot for a guy who's coming back from, again, a pretty serious respiratory condition. And, at this stage of his career, he was already slowing down a little bit with Chicago towards the end of his time there. Asking him to keep doing like top 6 minutes, especially from 2 years off, might not be really within the realm of reason. So if somebody can really rise up and seize a strong center role, especially one of the younger players, I think that Winnipeg would feel very comfortable moving Toews into a role that might make a little more sense for where he is at this stage of his career. Getting a look at a future 2C as well for the Jets, somebody who can actually step in and not have to be traded for, would be fan-friggin-tastic. So if Yager can find a way to do it, man, that would be such a transformative moment for the Jets and the season, and really for the next several years. But again, I don't think it's going to be this season. I think we're probably talking a little more like next year with some games for Yager this season. But curious to know how you feel about that. amidst all that, of course, I also want to talk a little bit about that 2C spot in particular, because it might not just be an internal thing that the Jets go with. They might think that they need to bring in somebody from outside the Jets organization. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's closing thoughts here. I wanted to talk a little bit about whether or not the Jets actually have their real 2C. So, Toews was brought in. He was talked about a little bit in the 2C light earlier today, and Winnipeg has certainly made it seem like JT is the guy. But I think Winnipeg is also very cognizant of the fact that with Toews, there's a lot of risk. He might not be the guy to go even above the fourth line. He might be maybe a third line center. In an ideal world, he comes in, he rediscovers the fountain of youth, and he's a 2C bona fide from the top to bottom. I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think that that's banking on a lot of things that just aren't that realistic. You need to hope for the best, but expect the worst. We often talk about in business risk management, and I think that that's where something like this comes in. And I think the Jets probably do feel like they have to do some of this as well, which kind of brings up a big question as to whether or not the Jets might need to go shopping for a 2C. We talk about this every year. It's always a thing with this team, and especially with Toews not really being a known quantity right now, the Jets can't really rely on anything in particular. They're kind of taking some educated guesses based on his practice skates, some conditioning stints, his own, feedback that he's giving them, and what they're seeing maybe in some of his skate footage. But beyond that, we don't really know what he's like in game states at this point, because he hasn't played hockey at a high level in years, literally years. So you got to have some sort of a backup plan. And that's kind of where I think Lowry ideally would have been your 2C, but he's already injured. And I am a little worried about Adam. He is still on crutches from what I last heard from folks who saw him around Winnipeg. That's a little alarming. His surgery, hip surgery for something that he's had for a couple of years now, that doesn't sound like a very simple process. And if his rehab takes longer and he starts getting back, closer to a winter return rather than the fall, it kind of puts the Jets in a tough spot. You don't really want Toews to have to be the 2C for months and months and months. So I think ideally you have him in your bottom six to really fortify that center depth down there, but not make him your bona fide 2C for the rest of the year. I don't think that was the plan. I don't think that they want to do that. And I would imagine Lowry is going to be the guy that they ask to do more of these duties alongside Toews. And so with, the number of options really looking limited, I wonder if the Jets are going to go after Mason McTavish. I talked about him yesterday as a real option. McTavish, assuming that things have really gone south with the Ducks, and again, we don't have a lot of confirmation of this, just hearsay and rumors, but if you are really thinking that you need a piece like this to complete your top six and push the Jets into a more competitive state, I would understand. I think McTavish gets you a lot of purchase, and I also think it, redefines what the season's going to be, because suddenly one of the biggest pieces that you've been missing the last few years now falls into place. And your wing depth, where, you maybe had some concerns, if Lambert or Chibrikov takes a spot, you have a lot more roster flexibility and a much better skill and speed matchup than you might have had before bringing McTavish in. So there's a lot of reason to think about the Jets maybe making a really big splash towards the end of summer. I think right now things are not going to be at a great state. The market's going to be very hot, and I think it's going to be a seller's market. So if the Jets are wise, I would think that they're going to be patient. I doubt that they're really going to jump in on the first couple of deals unless they really feel like they're going to miss out on someone. I would expect them to be patient. And usually when they're patient is when some really underrated talent like a Niederreiter or something falls through the cracks and the Jets get him for almost nothing. We still already, have a mind for like an Evan Rodriguez. He might not be a center, but he'll bring that wing depth. So the Jets have a lot of options, but you have to think that they are still shopping for at least a center or a winger. They need somebody to replace Ehlers, and they still need a 2C, even if Toews is likely to do it in the meantime. You can't really rely on one of the Jaegers of the world to be the guy immediately. He might get there at some point, but probably not this season. So have, an established plan if you really want to be competitive. If you don't, and you are really just trying to sort of toe the line of competitiveness without overcommitting and spending assets and kind of waiting and seeing how the season really unfolds, then, maybe you wait to make a deal closer to the trade deadline. There's no saying that you have to do it during the summer and get out ahead of things really aggressively unless you feel like you want to swing for the fences immediately and start off strong. So the Jets have a couple of different ways they can go here. I would personally favor a little bit of patience just because I think there's going to be a mad scramble. And if the Jets are kind of looking at more of the veteran center types, they already missed out on Besser. So I actually think it would be wise to not go for a Horvat or something. Don't overcommit to a big contract that's going to age probably not super well over the next few years when you already have the flexibility to do something else. I think the Jets have been very smart on making a lot of non-committal deals here. With all these free agents, not a lot of money being spent, not a lot of term being handed out. I think that is about as an ideal position, ideal of a position as it gets when it comes to what the Jets probably need to do this season. So curious to know your thoughts on this. Do you feel like Winnipeg has given itself the best chance of being competitive? Do you think Winnipeg is maybe holding back a little bit? I'd be curious to know your interpretation because the way that I see it right now, Winnipeg is not throwing, all the chips on the table yet. They're waiting to see what shakes out. And if something good really does pop up and emerge, that's when they'll make their move. But I think that's going to take some time to really shake out until we see what this trade market looks like after the first couple of weeks. I think all these teams missed out on big free agents. They're all going to be desperate to do something. And that is when Winnipeg can mostly do its best damage. But I think we'll have to wait and see for the next couple of weeks. We'll talk about it throughout this offseason. Of course, we thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. Give me your predictions for a trade. If you think Winnipeg's going to make one, who do you think they'll bring in and who do you think goes out? Drop those in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.